You are listening to Megiddo Radio. Megiddo Radio is a radio ministry of Megiddo Films. For more, visit our website at www.megiddofilms.org. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. This is Paul Flynn from Megiddo Radio for the 28th of June, 2014. Thank you all for tuning in. On today's show and on this week's show, we're going to just continue on from the topic we were talking about for the last couple of episodes. On the last couple of episodes, we dealt with... on the last episode, we were talking with Richard Bennett with the title, Francis' Teaching on Economics, Merely Aquinas and Tradition, just showing what Pope Francis was teaching was not anything new. That this is also known as Catholic social teaching, or terms like social justice are banded around a lot. Also looked at Rerum Novarum on the 31st of May, and I also looked at that news story that broke at the start of May, I think it was May 9th, dealing with when Pope Francis called for the legitimate redistribution of wealth by the state. And I think sometimes people will either be shocked, or is this kind of new, or the liberal media are all being really impressed by him. This has been taught for centuries, and it is not as nice and as friendly as it may seem. What I want to look at today is one of the major... Last Thursday, when I did the interview with Richard Bennett, and actually at the moment we're working on seeing if one or two of you emailed just saying that there was a little bit of a difficulty in hearing Richard Bennett. That's the last episode. It's the 124th show that we did last Thursday. That there was a little bit of a difficulty hearing Richard, and that is mainly due to the fact that the audio was recorded so low, and there was... I think it was a problem with the internet on his end, maybe. I'm not too sure, but because I've tested it a million times in different people, it's always sounded really, really good. But for that one, it didn't turn out sounding brilliant. What I would recommend is people go onto the YouTube page and listen to the Megiddo TV version of it, if you're on the Megiddo on the Panomatic site. But there are a good friend of Richard is currently working, seeing if he can filter the sound and make Richard's voice sound a lot clearer. If that is achievable, I will take down the other version and put up a new version on both websites. I hope that's the case, and it'll be great because it was a really good interview. But I think the audio is definitely understandable even as it is, and you can go onto the YouTube page or listen to the last MP3. And you can listen to that, especially if you go onto the Megiddo TV version of it. You can look at the quotations. I have the quotations put on screen that Richard had provided for us. And one of those was from a document that Pope Francis wrote, which is called Joy of the Gospel, when he quotes from one of the sages of antiquity. And Richard positively identified that as Thomas Aquinas, that sage. When Francis quotes that sage of antiquity, that's what he calls him, not to share one's wealth with the poor is to steal from them and to take away their livelihood. It is not our goods which we hold, but theirs. This whole idea of the redistribution of the wealth. Now, I don't want to spend too much more time dealing with Pope Francis necessarily, but I want to show throughout the centuries, Rome, while she is a chameleon, while she changed her tactics, whether she's in Rwanda or the United States or in England or in Italy. They are different. Jesuits are different in different countries. They adapt to their environment. They adapt to their surroundings. If they're in India, they're different. If they're in Japan, they're different. They will become all things to all men, completely misquoting or misapplying Paul's admonition, to become all things to all men, that I may by some means gain some. That is understood as, well, I'll become a Hindu to the Hindus. I'll become a Protestant to the Protestants. I'll become again, Rome is like a chameleon, especially the Jesuit order, and Pope Francis is a Jesuit. who owes loyalty and obedience to his Jesuit superior, and especially to, ultimately, the Black Pope, who is the head of all that. Now, the idea of the economic thought of Rome, and even before the Jesuits were formed in 1540, before the Jesuits, in the 13th century, a particularly brilliant man, intellectually at least, Thomas Aquinas, had a huge influence on the Roman Catholic Church, especially on philosophy, on economics, and how they look at the Bible. He gained most of it from Aristotle. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas calls Aristotle, he calls him the philosopher. He doesn't actually call him Aristotle at times. Now, in other writings, he actually calls him Aristotle, but I'm not too sure about the chronology of all this, but he just calls him the philosopher. Now, there's a lot of things I want to go through here, just showing why Rome, while it has changed its outward tactics, Vatican II, it changed some of the things like the Latin Mass, etc., but its core never changed at all. And how it can remain frightfully and frighteningly consistent over the centuries, and it does in economic matters. It will tweak if, for example, in a nation, all that's available to them, and you've got, say, two parties, and maybe one is supporting capitalism and one is supporting communism. Communism is not their favorite choice, but they will support the communists then. But if it's fascism over communism, they will support the fascists. Hands down. As long as they're not hostile to Rome. Now, again, I've referenced this book a number of times, Ecclesiastical Megalomania by John W. Robbins. Excellent book on the subject, on the economic and political thought of the Roman Catholic Church. And he's got the first... Is it the first chapter? It's not the first chapter. It's right after the introduction, but it's on private property. And he says, quote, "In the 13th century, the Italian who became the official philosopher of the Roman Catholic Church state, Thomas Aquinas, wrote no treatise on economics, but his thinking, based on that of Aristotle, is foundational for understanding the economic thought of the Roman Church state." This quotation is also backed by when Henry William Spiegel says in The Growth of Economic Thought, he also says that a complete and authoritative statement of medieval economic thought may be found in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, a great figure in medieval scholasticism, whose system of thought was to become and has remained to the present time the official Catholic philosopher. And I think now, within Catholicism, there's sometimes, I've seen the odd debate about Thomism versus, and that's what Thomas Aquinas' philosophy is known as, Thomism. And because Thomas he lived in a place called Aquinas, it was that was the area he was from, that wasn't his surname. And that's why it's called Thomism, after his name, Thomas. Now, we see, this is why, and still to this day, this has not changed. Thomas Aquinas is still the official philosopher. He had a huge influence also on the Council of Trent. I believe they used as one of their major influences on the Council of Trent the Counter-Reformation, very long council that took place over 18 years from 1545 to 1563. The Counter-Reformation, spearheaded by the Jesuits. This council, which pronounced at least over 100 anathemas against Bible doctrines. Pronounced anathema against anyone who denied the doctrine of free will. Unfortunately, on that issue especially, most of the professing evangelicalism is on the side of Rome, sadly. Or anyone who will deny man's ability or cooperating with the grace of God, etc. These are the first opening canons of the Council of Trent. Aquinas had a major influence on that. Now, there are some professing Protestants at least, who will claim, who are starting to, and I've noticed this kind of a trend, just want to just briefly comment on it, not necessarily that this plays into his economic thought, but there's an idea that he laid the groundwork for what will become the Protestant Reformation, and he just clearly, if you study his writings, he was an ardent Romanist who said all the kings in Christendom, which was pretty much all of Europe and various other places, should be in submission to the Pope, the successor of Peter, he calls him, and as they would to the Lord Jesus Christ. So I'm going to show you that quote in a bit, but he was an ardent Romanist. There's no getting away that he was some kind of medieval Protestant, as some ministries are trying to claim at the moment, and trying to use some of his theology. He did not believe in the gospel of grace. He did not believe in, he believed in purgatory, but with the influence of people like C.S. Lewis, people don't seem to have a problem with that anymore. And this is unfortunately where we are today. But now, to understand Thomas Aquinas and how his philosophy led to, and just again quoting from page 30 from John W. Robbins' book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania, he states, Roman Catholic economic thought, as developed by the popes in their encyclicals and by Roman church-state councils, has been a contributor to, if not the only source of, several forms of anti-capitalist, political, and economic organization during the long hegemony of the Roman church state. Among these forms are, and he lists the forms of anti-capitalism that have come out from Rome: feudalism and guild socialism in Europe during the Middle Ages. Number 2, fascism in Italy, Spain, Portugal, Croatia, and Latin America in the 20th century. Number 3, Nazism in Germany in the 20th century. Number 4, interventionism and the redistributive state in the West, including the United States, in the 20th century. And number 5, liberation theology in Latin America and Africa in the 20th century. He is one of the men I would dearly love to have on the show, but he unfortunately passed away back in 2008 and is now he is now with the Lord. But this is a tremendous book, and I think his forte really was economics, John W. Robbins, and a lot of the people who are following on doing similar work, not quite exactly the same, because no man does there's nobody going to do exactly the same type of role, but the Trinity Foundation covers a lot of really good topics from what I've seen, and trinityfoundation.org is their website. And if you want to go on there and give a look, obviously always be discerning. I try to say, even on good websites, there can be things that not necessarily brilliant, but so he names out these things: feudalism, fascism, Nazism, interventionism, and the redistributive state. I mean, especially in the United States, America has developed a Romanist foreign policy for the last 100 years. Now, in the last, I don't know how many years, it's been influenced so much more from Fox News than, and I'm talking about pastors here, but more influenced by Fox News than they have been the Bible. Now, there's nothing wrong with defending your own land. There's nothing wrong with defending your own private property. Defending Christians, etc., and so on. But what has gone on in America is what Rome was involved with in the first Roman Empire Part 1, not the Roman Empire Part 2, well, both actually, Part 1 and Part 2, of this empire building and this idea of holy war, which is only really propagated and taught by Roman Catholicism and Islam. Same things keep propping up again. This is why it's so important to study history and really understand history. It's like, if you don't understand history, it's like being born yesterday. It really is. You will not be able to make sense of what's happening in the world. So, in order to understand Aquinas, now let's deal with Aquinas. And let's look at his view of law. And if you understand his view of law, you'll understand much of what Roman Catholicism and his thinking towards economics truly is. Now, his understanding of law was broken up into, especially his view on private property. He didn't outright deny private property. he didn't, in Rome and Rerum Novarum, and that encyclical written by Leo XIII in 1891, they're not going to say private property is an institution that needs to be destroyed. But what they will say is, they will say that private property is not an institution that cannot be touched. And it's based upon the common good, or the need has made it necessary in order to, well, we're going to take your land in order we can build this road, even though you don't want to sell it. That's how it really bears out, especially in various parts of the country. You have the eternal law. And according to Aquinas, the eternal law was God's plan for the universe and its inhabitants, as in rocks, plants, the falling of the ground when dropped, etc., plants growing, as in all things. More biblically, it'd be more like God's decree, all things, God's plan, God's sovereignty over all things. That's what he sees as eternal law. Natural law, and natural law is going to be important, really important to understand, is how rational creatures interact with the eternal law. Now, I really need your attention. Don't lose me here. In the natural law, what it basically is something that cannot be changed. If it's in the natural law, it cannot be touched. Something's in the natural law, for example, how men, people, and things interact with that, God's decree, otherwise, which Thomas calls the eternal law. And again, that title is misleading, but the natural law is that which can be almost derived from nature, etc. It cannot be touched. It is something of rational creatures, again, interacting with the eternal law, man being a social animal, etc. Number 3 is the positive law. The two important ones, if you remember anything else, it's the natural law and the positive law. Natural law cannot be changed, but the positive law is different. And there's nothing wrong with necessarily with the positive law according to... Now, the Bible has certain positive commands that God gives at certain times. And what we mean by positive law in the Bible would be, for example, things that are not part of the eternal law. The eternal law, for example, can be summarized in the 10 Commandments. I'm not talking about Aquinas' understanding here, but I'm talking about what the biblical understanding is. The 10 Commandments as the eternal law or the moral law is summarized. The first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all the heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as your strength. On these do all the law and the prophets hang, as in, to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, and strength is the first table of the law. On these do all the laws. They all hang on these. Because the first table of the law, the first 4 commandments, are about a relationship with God. The second table of the law, the final 6 commandments, are about a relationship or a horizontal relationship with man. Now, that's the eternal law. That's the true eternal law. But there's also positive laws. For example, in the Garden of Eden, God said, "You shall not eat of the tree of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." That was a positive commandment. We don't have a commandment like that anymore. But it tested the obedience of man collectively. Man failed. In Adam, all die. And as much as Adam sinned in the garden, we all sinned in the garden because he was our federal head. When Adam disobeyed the positive commandment of do not eat that fruit, he also, first of all, and more importantly, broke the commandments of God. He broke God's law, his eternal law, that never changes. It shows forth his characteristics of who he is. That's why in Psalm 1, it talks about the blessed man meditating upon God's law day and night. Basically, meditating upon God. This is the very characteristics of God. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Things like that. 1 John 5:3. If we love him, we'll keep his commandments because we love his commandments. and these commandments are not grievous. Now, the thing is, we won't keep them perfectly, and this is not about salvation, but this is the characteristic fruit of someone who has been converted. Now, so the natural law cannot change, but the positive law is different. The positive law, which is customs, laws, and regulations, rules attempting to apply, and I'm quoting from John W. Robbins because he's got a good explanation of this. Positive law, which is the customs, laws, and regulations, right, by rulers attempting to apply the natural law to individuals and societies. As in, the positive law is something that's custom that has been added to the natural law. It can be good in certain circumstances. Some parts of the positive law can be accepted, but it is always subservient to the positive law. Now, the question is, in Aquinas' understanding, false understanding, really, of this, is private property part of the positive law, or is it part of the natural law? Thomas wrote, the possession of all things in common and universal freedom, so the possession of all things in common and universal freedom are said to be of the natural law. So, ownership of all things and all people, which is basically the state owning everything, is part of the natural law, because to it, the distinction of possessions and slavery were not brought in by nature, but devised by human reason for the benefit of human life. He also states that the community of goods is ascribed to the natural law, not that the natural law dictates that all things should be possessed in common and that nothing should be possessed as one's own, but because the division of possessions is not according to the natural law, but rather arose from human agreement. You see, according to Aquinas, this is a human addition. This is a human understanding. But if you go by natural law, then the universal, the community of goods, the common good, etc., is part of the natural law. And in order to be just in a just society, these things need to be distributed each according to his ability, each according to his need, just like the communists stating. He says, but rather from human agreement, which belongs to positive law. Hence, the ownership of possessions is not contrary to natural law. And when people read that, they go, it's not contrary to natural law. And free market Roman Catholics, and there are some out there who argue for especially Austrian economics, will go to certain quotations and say, you see, it is not against natural law, or various other arguments that you might hear. There's different ones all the time. But here's what it says. But it's an addition thereto devised by human reason. It is an addition. It is not inalienable. It is not untouchable. We can take your private property from you. It is not an inalienable right. Now, Rome has introduced so many rights through different governmental bodies, through the influence that she has in various institutions and various legal agreements that she has made between state and state. It is a church state, in order that it has brought in this idea of a myriad, so many rights. For example, the right of free education, the right of free healthcare, the right, you don't even have to say the right to life. You just say, well, thou shalt not kill. It's in the commandments. The right to... You go on and on through it. These big, long lists of rights, especially ones that are brought into the United States through various administrations, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was, for example, himself influenced by a member of his staff, John Augustus Ryan, who was a Roman Catholic moral teacher, and he wrote a book called Distributive Justice, which is dealing with a lot of social justice, and he wrote a book also on the minimum wage. I think it was the working wage. I have it there somewhere. But John Augustus Ryan, who had big influence on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who made the American government 3 times as big before and after the Second World War. Now, so he sees private property as an addition, almost like a human invention, not something. Aquinas, and just to reiterate and requote the quotation from Richard Bennett the last day, Thomas wrote, in cases of need, and how do you define need? In case of need, all things are common property, so that there would seem to be no sin in taking another person's property, for need has made it common. It encourages theft and stealing from people. Now, I'm going to be looking through a number of... I want to look more and more, because this will be... I don't know if this will be, especially for the next month or so, unless another major story breaks, will be the last show I do in economics. I wanted to do a number of shows in economics, showing where it comes from, showing the progression, showing how Rome always does this, and it leads, especially if you look at the reign of Pope Leo the 13th, is it Leo, not Leo the 13th, Pius the 13th, Pacelli's reign, that Eugenio Pacelli was his name. This is the Pope during the Second World War, and the agreements, the concordance between him and Hitler, between him and Mussolini, between the Vatican and Mussolini. And the deadly wound was healed, and the Vatican regained its political power through legal agreement. And the Vatican has so much power, and you can see so many nations becoming more and more Romanist in their foreign policy, in their economic policy, and do not listen to the arguments that somehow, and I've heard this on Fox News so many times when I've been watching various people, some people who are really good economists in their own right, quoting Thomas Aquinas at times, making him sound like a libertarian. No way, shape, or form was Thomas Aquinas some kind of libertarian at all. Now, and it's kind of shocking that people claim to have read him. Okay. Now, there's a number of different quotations I want to look at. This is a good place to start. If you want to start with Aquinas and you want to go straight to his economic thought, which is what I wanted to do at the beginning especially, and I want to study him out further, because I do believe a lot of his theology is entering into Protestantism, but we'll just deal with the economic thought here. There's a really good book. You could probably get it really cheap. I don't know if it's still in circulation, because I think this was an old library book when I bought it a number of years ago. It's Aquinas' Selective Political Writings, and it's been edited with an introduction by A.P. Dontre. That's Entrves. French was never really my strong point, and it's been translated by J.G. Dawson, and it's published. Just type into Amazon if you want to get a copy of this. This is his Selected Political Writings, Aquinas, Selected Political Writings, but this is not the only collection of, and it's quite thin, it's like 200 pages or something like that, and it's got the Latin and English right beside each other, so if you actually can speak Latin, the language that Aquinas wrote in, then you might really get a lot out of this. But there's a number of different books that have compiled Aquinas' writings over the years, political writings, because this is what you really want, political, and his political thought, basically. Now, in one of his... This is not from the Summa Theologica, by the way, in case people... The next quotation I have is not from the Summa Theologica, it's from On Princely Government, where he shows his favor of not the individual and individual responsibility and individual, you could say rights, but the thing is, I don't even like saying individual rights, because you should obey, you have your right to private property. Somebody else can't steal from you. Somebody else can't murder you. And these are really, once you go through, what you have the quote-unquote right to is basically what the Ten Commandments allows you to do, or what the moral law, God's moral eternal law, allows you to do. So rather than coming up with a list of rights, as in rights to free healthcare, right to free education, right to this, that, and the other, right to work. That one sounds wonderful, but really just means that the government's going to come in and make sure they're going to have equal amount of minorities, equal amount of men and women. I wonder how that's going to affect the fishing industry, and they've been trying to do that. So you have to be careful with those things. They sound wonderful, and the European Union has been based off of the fundamental rights and human rights and human dignity and all this kind of stuff that Rome starts with. And as you study it through, you just see the similarities between it is Roman law, canon law, being brought into the state slowly. Different states, slowly. Now, Aquinas writes, but the good of the community is greater and more divine than the good of the individual. Now, how do you define the good of the... Basically, the community is more important than the individual. This is classic collectivism. Thus, the hurt of some individual is sometimes to be tolerated if it makes for the good of the community. Okay, we're about 30 minutes into the show, so I don't want to spend too much longer on this point. And the next quotation I want to look at is just to show that he was very... If you want to define Aquinas today and what his economic and political thought will lead to, it is fascism, a controlled economy where the state, basically, who else is going to decide what the needs of the people are and how the wealth should be redistributed? It's going to be done by the state, especially, and it's particularly dangerous when the state does not have any thought for the laws of God, but more the laws of the Pope. And Adolf Hitler was a faithful Roman Catholic. He was not excommunicated. And as General Franco said, Adolf Hitler, son of the Catholic Church, died while defending Christianity in Europe. Now, I'm paraphrasing that, and that's in Edmund Paris's book on the Jesuits. I read that a number of years ago, but it shows you, and Rome has been written out of the history books. It's astonishing. Aquinas writes, and this is why no faithful Protestants should be really looking, unless they want to refute Aquinas or just see what, but don't go to him as a reliable source. He states, it is from him that the royal priesthood derives, and that what is more, all the faithful of Christ be members of him, being thus priests and kings. Now we can agree with that. We're priests and kings. The ministry of this kingdom is entrusted not to the rulers of this earth, but to priests, so that the temporal affairs may remain distinct from the spiritual. And in particular, it is delegated to the high priest, the successor of Peter, the vicar of Christ, the Roman pontiff. It's delegated to him, to whom all kings of Christendom should be subject, as to the Lord Jesus Christ himself. Serve the Pope in the same way you would serve Christ. Because and if you look at various quotations on history, he is God. If you look at the Vatican, in the Vatican there's a portrait of Benedict XVI, and it says, Benedict XVI, the way and the truth and the life. How blasphemous can you get? And that's been there since, I think, 2005. You can look it up. Benedict XVI, the way, the truth, and the life. If you don't believe me, look it up on Google Images, should bring it up. This picture that the Pope, more than just being a representative of Christ, but actually being him in the flesh. So very much a Romanist, very much a Romanist in every account. But unfortunately, there's been more of a movement in some circles in order to get Aquinas accepted. Now, let's look at private. Let's go back to the idea about private property. Private property. And I wanted to just spend one show, and really one show only, on Aquinas, so that it would be up on the internet because I haven't seen anybody covering it from this point of view, and anything on Aquinas is either maybe somebody promoting him or Roman Catholics talking about him, etc. But let's let him speak from his own words. This is from his Summa Theologica. In the case, I'm just going to I'll read from the beginning of the point. Things may be said to pertain to the natural law for two reasons. Remember the natural law. We're talking about the natural law cannot change. The positive laws, human customs, traditions, things to apply the natural law to. The natural law does not change. The positive law is added to. Okay? He says about the natural law, first, if there is a natural inclination to them, as, for example, that is wrong to do injury to one's neighbor. Secondly, if nature does not lead us to do what is contrary. So we might say that that man has a natural right to go naked because nature, not having provided him with clothing, he has to fashion it for himself. In this sense, this is the important part here. In this sense, the common possession of all things and the equal liberty of all, and what they mean by equal liberty of all, because they see slavery as some kind of poverty, not having enough money, etc. You need to redistribute the wealth. In this sense, common possession of all things and equal liberty of all can be said to pertain to the natural law. For neither private possession nor servitude were imposed by nature. They are adoptions of human reason in the interests of human life. And in these cases, the natural law is not altered, but is added to. That's the positive law. It's added to. So if it's added to, if need dictates so, and the common good should be necessary, then your private property rights can be taken back because it's part of the positive law. It is not part of natural law, according to Aquinas. This is why for centuries, various types of collectivism, communism, socialism, fascism, feudal guild socialism, etc., have come from the writings, liberation theology, etc., have come from the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Why? Because depending on how you define need, will define how much property rights there are, how much state control that you have. Who defines that? Again, it is the state that will define that. It is not God's word, that is for sure. Now, let's look at the limits of private property. And let's look at this next page here. And this will probably be the last show, at least for a while, depending on what happens in the news. And I might do some critiques on various comments that Pope Francis might make in the future, but beyond that, not much. Now, he talks about the limits of private property. With respect to material things, and this is again from his Summa Theologica, because not all the quotes are from his Summa Theologica. With respect to material things, there are 2 points which man must consider. First, concerning the power of acquisition and disposal, and in this respect, private possession is permissible. Okay, so I'll just repeat that again. First, concerning the power of acquisition and disposal, in this respect, private possession is permissible. And I think it's when people read that, they go, oh, see, the Pope is then advocating private property, ergo capitalism. But it's not capitalism if you, as the Bible states in Genesis 1:27, or 1:26 and 1:27, God said, let us make man in our own image, and after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth. To have dominion, that dominion mandate, where all things in your possession are subdued to the power of God. Doesn't mean you steal from somebody else, you cannot. And we're not talking about just taking over governments and taking over the 7 pillars of influence. That is a deviation from the truth completely. Now, let's look at, so it says, in that respect, private property, so sometimes private property is permissible, okay? It never really defines it, and again, it becomes up to the individual popes and how this is applied. It is also necessary to human life for three reasons. First, again, and he will argue at different times, Aquinas and Rerum Novarum and these other documents, for how it is helpful and necessary, but it is still, even if it's necessary, it's subservient to the common good. That has to be really... They will argue that way at times. And it's like, well, how do you reconcile this? Private property is not to be destroyed, but the common good is over it. And the private property can be diminished, taken away, temporarily taken away from you, etc., depending on the need. It's also necessary for human life for three reasons. First, because everyone is more concerned with the obtaining of what concerns himself alone than with the common affairs of all and of many others. For each one, avoiding extra labor leaves the common task to the extra man, as we see when there are too many officials. Secondly, because human affairs are dealt with in a more orderly manner. See, he's giving out here are the positive added to customs that are really good. And he'll give a couple other reasons. But then I'm going to skip on a bit because it would take too much time to quote all of it. I'm just going to skip on a little bit. The other point which concerns man in regard to material things in their use is that man should not hold material things as their own, but to the common benefit. And again, look, if you see your neighbor in need, fine, that's different. But you are not told that if you do not give it to him, it's theft. That, well, really your neighbor owns your stuff. Now look at he says, the common possession of things to be attributed to natural law, not in the sense that natural law decrees all things to be held in common, and that there is to be no private possession, but in the sense that there is no distinction of property on grounds of natural law, but only by human agreement. See, it's a human invention, really. It's a human addition. He says also, and this pertains to positive law, as we have already shown. You see, this idea of natural law and positive law continually reemerges in Thomas's writings. Thus, private property is not opposed to natural law. Again, quoting that, but is in addition to it, devised by the human reason. It comes from the word of God. Thou shalt not steal. Doesn't give you stipulations. Oh, the common good says we're allowed to steal at certain points. Never is that there at any stage. Now, he talks about in different parts the good of collectivism. So there are limits on private property, and that ultimately, brethren, is what fascism is. It is a controlled economy. And when you look throughout history, when you gaze your eyes towards when Rome ruled Europe, what was the common characteristic of it? Poverty, ignorance, top-down controlling government. This is, they talk about, they brought us Western society. They held back Western society in the Dark Ages for almost I don't know how many years, at least in the 7th century onwards. And it wasn't a good thing for Christianity when it was seen as advantageous from Constantine onwards to be a Christian. Because the church was then filled with false converts. People who would say they're Christian in order to, feather the nest, basically. And if you look at the agreements, the Concordat, which is a kind of canon law legal agreement between the Vatican and the state, between Mussolini in the early 1920s, between Hitler in the early 1930s, not sure about the exact date, but it paved the way for Mussolini and Hitler to rise to power. Very much mutually advantageous for both parties, neutralizing much of the vast Roman Catholic population in the southern Germany. If you look, and I think by a tree you shall know its fruit. Look at Roman Catholic countries today. Now, there hasn't never been really a proper Christian nation. I know they said the United States of America, but you have, right in the Constitution, various deists and people who deny the deity of Christ and vehemently oppose the Christian religion. Now, outwardly, they did not do that, but in their private writings, they were very much of the same ilk as Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine was the philosophical progenitor to the 1776 American Revolution. But if you look at Roman Catholic countries today, productivity low. Women tend to be much harder workers than men. And it tends out to be like this, that you will get the more temptation to see young people who've never done a day's work in their life staying on social welfare. Why? Because social welfare amounts are so high, and they don't need to get off. They can just stay live in their parents' house for up until they're probably about the age of 30 or 40, until they feel forced out of sheer embarrassment to move out of there. But when you have an excessive interventionism, when you have this idea that you need to tax the productive and give to those who are unproductive, I often hear the argument in various areas of the country where it's like, well, how about this area? They need social welfare. No, they need to get a job. The more welfare, the more state aid, or more anything, free stuff you give places, the poorer the place has been. I mean, by that attitude, for example, look at Africa. Africa has received, as a continent, more state aid than any other continent in the world, and it's still poor. It doesn't work. The best thing you can do for the Africans is get them work, trade with them. If you really want to help them, don't give them stuff. Let them work for it. It will be good for them. If you give someone something for nothing, then it will become a right, a privilege. We deserve this. This is our right. And when you do that, if you look at the protests at the moment in Brazil around the World Cup and things like that, and you're demanding, we'll build schools, and it's terrible what the state is doing there in Brazil, as in they're building stadiums rather than other things that are more needed. But here's the thing. They are crying out for the government to stay large. We depend on the government to make schools, to do all these public facilities and all that. But really what you should be saying is, make the government smaller and do exactly what it's supposed to do, as in punish criminals, execute murderers, bring those who should, say, if you've got a contract between two parties and one person breaks a contract, bring that person who breaks the contract before the courts, and there's a punishment. The state only should get involved when there's a breach of contract, when there's a crime being brought in. But if you want the state to bring you from cradle to grave, and you think it's unjust that there's, for example, there's a reason why half the world's in poverty. Now, sometimes people are born in not great circumstances, but often it's unproductive. Often, if you look at various parts, even in Ireland, where I'm living at the moment, or anywhere else, where the least productive places are, often it's not because they're incredibly hardworking. It's often because they're not hardworking, and the state gives them too much. And the thing is, and then the state intervenes once more, raising the minimum wage, saying, oh, we're giving people a raise. We've raised the minimum wage from €8 to €10. Say, for example, just say they did that. It's about €8 in Ireland at the moment. And they raised it to €10. Isn't that wonderful? What it would do is, places will not, sometimes are on borderline, and if they say, well, we have to pay all these workers $8 or $10 or €10 an hour, forget that. They'll fire most of the people. A lot of people will lose their jobs. And those people who are on €15 an hour are not going to have their wages raised. It doesn't change wages at all. But what it does is it prevents the 15-year-old, the 12-year-old who would probably get a job doing something for $5 an hour. But that's illegal now. It pragmatically, state intervention, when it always thinks it's doing the right thing, thinks it will some way benefit the economy, it is detrimental to the economy. Always. I can't think of any enterprise where, see, it's always politicians using other people's money, not their own, in order to get votes. And people want free stuff. And when you give them free stuff, they want more. You give them, you raise entitlements, you raise children's allowance. Whose responsibility is it to provide for your children? It is the parents. The father goes out and works. The mother provides, stays home and raises them. And the father teaches, don't believe for a second that that's not his role. He absolutely has to go home and teach his wife, teach his children, lead them in family worship before the throne of God every morning and evening at least, and train them up in the ways they should go so that when they're old, they will not depart from it. Proverbs 22, verse 6, a little bit of a paraphrase of that verse. Now, again, what is the proper biblical role of state? And this is what I want to bring us back to. The teachings of Rome on economics will lead to political and economic fascism. Always does. And that's what it is. It's a controlled economy. Private property in some cases, but national, whatever you want to call it. It is collectivism, and it has brought you regimes such as, look at the untold miseries of millions because of the equal distribution of poverty, and that's all it brings people. But regardless of the pragmatic arguments, and though there are some compelling arguments maybe, but we also have to say, thou shalt not steal. You have your own things. And individual responsibility, if you take away, and if you say, no, it's not the individual's responsibility, it's a collective responsibility. This is what you get from these kind of writings. This is what you get from this kind of philosophy. This is what you get from it. Oh, it's not his fault. It's because of his surroundings. It's all our faults. No, the individual must take responsibility for what he has done. God will not, before the judgment seat of Christ, will not be judging people as groups. He will not be judging, it won't be all the workers' union together being judged and cast into the lake of fire. It will be, how to put this, it will be individuals, and individuals will be held accountable according to their individual failings if they are not in Christ. If they are in Christ, individuals, then they have Christ's righteousness imputed to his account, to their account, based on the work of another, based on his fulfilling of the law on their behalf. And the thing is, what we have to do is, as Christians, and I know this stuff is creepy and things like that, we have to say, because the Bible does have a lot to say about economics. Private property is an institution right there in the Bible. It is one of the reasons why, after the Protestant Reformation, economic prosperity spread throughout the land. Now, the gospel is not an economic message. Let's not make that mistake. It is not the social gospel we're talking about here. But the benefits of those who've been redeemed and saved, and those who are not following the Bible, should be this. Their lives will be changed, and they will be better stewards over what God has given them. And they will subdue all, because they've been regenerated hearts, because of the power of the Spirit of God, and they will render all things to the glory of God. When they're given a child or children, they will say, we're going to train them in the fear and admonition and nurture of the Lord. That way they can go forth and serve him. This is not, when people think, oh, well, this is all selfish and da-da-da-da. We have to, what is our ultimate authority? Because ideas like social justice and dealing with poverty and has come into the modern swing of books. Roman Catholic Aquinas or Thomistic teachings on economics is creeping into evangelicalism. It really is, and I'm starting to see it more and more. Thomas Aquinas influenced Luigi Tapparelli, the Jesuit, who also taught Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum is a hugely important document. If you look at the compendium of social teaching of the church, which is the official documents of the Roman Catholic Church state, at the back of it, I remember reading it, it talks about 100 years or over 100 years of Rerum Novarum. And if you don't know what Rerum Novarum is, I would really recommend that you listen to show number 123. This is show number 125. Okay, we've nearly been on for an hour now. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And if you've got any comments or queries or videos you'd like to send on or anything you may want me to critique in the future, sometimes people send me on articles which are incredibly helpful, and sometimes I may not reply to everybody's email, but they're truly appreciated. And I just pray that, just keep the show in your prayers, and I pray that this has been a benefit to some of you. I pray that it may start off a study, not so much in the writings of Aquinas, but in the study of the Word of God. May God bless you all.